Why doesn't anything work anymore? The government, corporations, the schools, and even the church. Why aren't my prayers answered? Why is there so much violence? Is there anything I can do when I'm afraid and powerless? What is God doing anyway? Noted biblical scholar Walter Wink's 30 years of work and 3 books on what the Bible calls the principalities and the powers address these questions. And the most helpful and hopeful message is that the whole world was created good, including institutions and systems, and they belong to God, just like we do. They often lose their way, just like we do, but they can be transformed, just like we can, and we can help it happen. Now we're going to watch as Janet Wolfe, gifted inner-city pastor, and Jim Forbes, one of Newsweek's 10 best U.S. preachers, talk with Walter for our benefit about his work. Afterwards, we hope you'll continue the conversation. We know about violence. It's everywhere. If not in our daily lives, on the front page and in the 6 o'clock news. And we know about extending ourselves and even not returning evil for evil. But what do we know about resisting, even defying evil, without using evil methods? And what do we know about making our weakness our strength? We'll listen in as Janet and Jim and Walter struggle with this challenge right after a quick review of Jesus' teaching in the previous program.
Do not resist one who is evil is not nearly strong enough a translation. It should be more like, do not resist evil violently. Don't mirror evil. Don't let your opponent dictate the terms of your opposition. The New Scholar's Bible has the best translation of all, I think. It's, do not react violently to the one who is evil. Do not react violently to the one who is evil. That's what Jesus is trying to get at. He's not saying don't resist evil. He's just saying don't resist evil violently, but resist it a different way, non-violently. You've given him the back of the hand, and then he turns the other cheek. Now what will you do?
I can't hit him anymore.
You can't use that one. You can't use this one. You got a great target for a fist, though.
That's right.
But the problem was the fist fights were held only between equals, and the last thing you want to establish is his equality with you. You're trying to get him back down. So he's really challenging you to hit him with your fist, and you can't do that. So he's really got you in a dilemma, doesn't he? So instead of an act of submission or obeisance, this turning the other cheek is actually an act of defiance. It's not anything of the sort of what we've interpreted as being. The law only requires the outer garment, actually. You don't have to give it to me.
What am I going to do?
And my socks?
Your socks?
Yeah, my socks.
Oh, not a
Here,
sock.
take my socks.
Socks?
Take the other sock as well.
This is terrible.
Here you go.
Oh,
Yeah.
I'm terribly sorry. I don't know
my
what
sock
he's
and
what's
doing.
going on
My
here,
shirt?
God?
Your
What
shirt?
My shirt,
You can't
yeah.
take your coat.
But
shirt
she
off in
wants
court?
all.
No.
Yeah, she wants everything, so you might as well take my shirt as well.
My
Here.
gosh,
Yeah.
what should I
Take
do,
my shirt.
Judge? Oh,
Yeah,
I've never
my
seen anything
shirt.
like this. In that world, that Semitic world, shame fell on the person who beholds your nakedness. Not the person who's naked, but the one who observes it.
Okay, stop.
What?
The 1 mile.
Oh, let's not
Give
carry
me back
it.
my
No,
pack.
I don't mind carrying it a little
Hey,
further.
come
No,
on, come on. Give me
it's
back
no
my
trouble.
pack.
I mean,
You're gonna get me in
nothing
trouble.
to it, man. It's
Give me back my pack.
You a centurion?
Yes, I am.
Hey, this is my second mile, boss.
A second
Carrying his
mile?
pack. Now, what we've overlooked here is that it puts the soldier in violation of military law and jeopardizes him with his commanding officer. So this is far from what we've made it, a statement about extending yourself, but this is actually a situation in which the tables are turned on the soldier, kind of like in moral jujitsu. So what do you think of Jesus' teaching about nonviolence? Is it a viable option in a world that seems increasingly violent as days go by?
I told somebody that, I've tried to practice this Jesus thing. When people treat me badly, to just kind of turn the other cheek, to sort of just keep pressing on. But, it is true that sometimes if you don't understand what's at the heart of what Jesus is talking about, you can really get clobbered unnecessarily.
This passage is right in front of the one on loving your enemy, and in Luke's version of it, in fact, they're woven together so that the love of enemy and turning the other cheek are united. And I think it's important to remind ourselves of that this is not just a strategy for outsmarting the opponent, which in these three stories it does do. But it also has figured into it the fact that this other person, this oppressor, is actually a child of God. And so nonviolence is a way then of actually implementing the love of an enemy, and not only trying to free the oppressed but from the oppressor, but also trying to free the oppressor from sinning.
There is a difference between non-resistance and nonviolence, and in fact, nonviolence, you should be saying this because it's your writing, nonviolence is for folks who are violent, right? For folks for whom violence is very real. The anger and the rage is there. The understanding of our own potential for violence is clear. And in the midst of that, we choose another way because of who we are and how we are defined by God's presence.
Yeah, I like to say I'm a violent person trying to become nonviolent. But the trouble is I really don't like to say it. I'm humiliated to say it. I'm embarrassed to say it, that I lose it with my grandkids occasionally. I'm really embarrassed that I, after all these years, still lose my control with anger. But I'm trying to become a person who's nonviolent. I'm trying to conceive of ways I can act that way. Curiously enough, in Christian history, I just want to go back to that distinction you made between non-resistance and nonviolence. St. Augustine interpreted this passage. He's one of the great fathers in the, the 5th century. He interpreted this passage as teaching that Christians can't resist evil if anybody attacks them. However, he said, if anybody attacks your neighbor, you've got to go to your neighbor's defense. And by that little twist, he legitimized just war and torture, capital punishment, and use of force and so forth. And for 1,500 years after that, then most of the churches followed meekly along in St. Augustine's path and declared war as just. And you know, Christians in Europe account for 2/3 of all the people ever killed on the planet Earth. Christians fighting Christians, because of this just war theory, justifying everything like that. Now, during the Protestant Reformation, the Mennonites and the Brethren developed this sort of nonviolent understanding, but it was really non-resistance. And so the Amish withdrew from society. The Mennonites were trying to live faithfully in their own enclave, but didn't try to change the larger society. Now, I'm trying to suggest that both of those interpretations were wrong, and that what Jesus is talking about is not non-resistance, which both Augustine and the Mennonites and Brethren championed, but non-violent direct action, you know, a very, as you said, militant, strong position. Now, I think a lot of people, myself included, have been trained by Christianity to be cowards. And I'm mad about that. I'm angry that I was trained to be a coward by my church, or by my understanding of this passage. And I think there are a lot of people out there in the churches who are just waiting for some reason to be heroic.
With Dr. King, I really think we found a way to be heroic. We were taught, in effect, that what you've got to do is you've got to recognize that you have the power to break a cycle which is a destructive cycle. An eye for an eye means that everybody's going to end up being blind, he used to tell us. And we have to learn to begin where we are. I found out early in my life that I too had quite a temper. In fact, might as well confess it publicly, after being teased by a sister, remember picking up a glass and throwing it at her. And if she had not covered her eye, I might have a blind sister on my conscience, at least in that eye. So early on, I figured out if there is a way to avoid being pushed into conditions of provocation, I should learn how. And I think, for example, with our children shooting kids, children saying, I have to go and carry my gun to school because that's the only way I can survive. Oh, if only we had begun early on.
And I think another part of that is to recognize the violence of the overall system, so that we're not simply teaching conflict resolution to some parts of our population who are enveloped in violent situations created by economic and political decisions. Because I think in our country right now, that's kind of how we're focusing. We're doing a lot of conflict resolution in inner city schools. That's crucial. That's important. I'd also like to see conflict resolution dealt in the Pentagon.
The Alternative to Violence project, which the Quakers started, is in a lot of schools, but especially in prisons. It began in prisons, teaching nonviolent alternatives within the prison setting, which the prisons must be the most violent institutions in our society. So there's some very exciting new applications of nonviolence going on right now. I just want to share this story. A woman told it to me in one of our workshops recently, because even though it's quite gross, I think it's a wonderful illustration of how you can use your weakness, in a situation as a strength. This kid was on the school bus, and there was a bully on the bus that was terrorizing the whole bus. And this went on week after week after week. And the kid, the woman who was telling the story, it was her kid. He had sinusitis and chronic running of his sinuses, and he was very slightly built, very small. And everybody picked on him. Finally, he had all he could stand of this bully. And so one day he just went and blew his hand full of snot. And then he walked up to the bully and he said, "I want to shake the hand of a real bully." And the bully started backing away, back to the very back of the bus, took a seat, and he never bothered anyone again, because those sinuses were always ready. They were always ready.
We don't have to wait till we've arrived at some point of perfection until we start practicing nonviolence. It is a way of life. It's not sort of after you love everybody, after you figure out all the other things that you might do. It's a way of life that we can choose now, that has endless ways of becoming embodied. Sometimes we're better at it than others, but there are always a range of alternatives we can choose, and it's specifically designed for folks who don't have answers, who have not yet figured out all the ways of being who God has called us to be.
The basis for Jesus' teaching about nonviolence is different than what a lot of people have understood. There's been a kind of a perfectionist pacifism that has often, I think, brought down the just criticism of people who are suffering oppression, who say, you guys would rather be perfect than help us, relieve us of our oppression. You don't want to get stained by the world. And I think Jesus is coming at it from a completely different point of view. He's saying, look, nonviolence is the future. It's the only way the human race is going to be able to survive. And I think this is becoming really clear to people today. But it's not a matter of being perfect. You don't have to earn God's love by being nonviolent. I mean, God will love you whether you're nonviolent or not. God loves me when I lose my temper at my grandkid or whatever. God doesn't give up on me. So I'm just trying to do the best I can. And if I fail, if I flounder and fall and lose my temper and react violently or whatever, God can take care of that and put me back on my feet and start me back on the path. And I find this to be a much more humane understanding of nonviolence. It's not something for the perfected. It's not just for the few spiritual athletes who've achieved, the Olympics of the divine. It's for everybody. Every age, every sex, can be involved in this, not just war-aged young men.
In Nicaragua, I was talking with women who were trying to deal with the problem of abuse. You couldn't call up the law enforcement agency. So they decided what they would do was train kids and other women to get pots and pans and beat as loud as they could. And any time there was any kind of abuse and a woman would yell, then everybody would congregate at that particular point and bang on the pots and pans so that everyone would know what was happening. And it would be very clear that this man who was in this household was one of those who beat women, which is kind of a marvelous, it makes it visible. What had been hidden before becomes visible, and what had seemed like power for those who are strongest is taken as power by the very weakest, little tiny kids carrying around these pots and pans. And everybody then learns, first of all, that the violence is wrong, and second of all, that there's a way to end it. There's a way to make it stop.
I learned from someone about what we call traumatic stress disorders, and that if you live in a society where people are forced to live without food, without clothing, without shelter, without education, without an opportunity, that if you really tallied up at the end of the year, at the end of a decade, that the number of people who actually die or who engage in more overt violent behavior, that the conditions which create these situations actually result in the death rate of the community in a significant way. So for people who really are waiting for nonviolent opportunities, they don't have to wait for a big war or a big revolution. They must be aware of the silent but deadly violence of the inequities that exist. So people always...
And that's something we're not very good at. I mean, the whole language of what does violence include and what does it not include. I think it was January of 1989, there was a report put out by the Pentagon that listed African National Congress as a terrorist organization, not the apartheid government that imprisoned 10,000 children that year. But so it's limited by our political understandings. And then it's also limited by our willingness to just kind of close our eyes to most of the violence that surrounds us and pretend we are non-involved. So we become passive instead of engaging in any kind of nonviolent alternatives. And I think the political rhetoric right now, which includes the church rhetoric, is a part of that. Particularly in the southern part of the country, we are engaged in a labeling of who is acceptable and who is not, who is righteous and who is unrighteous. And there's a violence in shutting people out of the community. There have been a series of where folks have died of AIDS, where people show up at the funeral and say, you know, with their signs, you're going to hell. And they do that at the funeral. That's an incredible form of violence. There are children in this particular city where we're filming this. 1/3 of our children drop out of the school system. 1/3 of our children are written off by the public education system. That's a form of violence we have dismissed.
It would be easy to become discouraged when one sees how much structural violence there is at loose in the world today. And so I think it's important to remind ourselves of the gains that have been made through nonviolence. I was tabulating. In 1989 alone, there were 13 nations that underwent nonviolent revolutions, and all but one were successful, and that was China. And those 13 countries comprised 1/3 of the human race. 1.7 billion people were involved in nonviolent revolutions in 1 year. Now, if you add up all the other nonviolent revolutions of this century, that at least that I could think of or find, 2/3 of the human race in this century have undergone nonviolent revolutions, and almost all of them were successful. Now, that's the thing that's surprising. The success rate of nonviolence is extraordinarily high, much higher than warfare. Warfare, in fact, only works half the time.
And
somebody always has to lose.
what would that mean if we actually prepared people for nonviolent creative action? I mean, you say in your book, you know, think of the possibilities if the church on a regular basis engaged not only members of the church but the community in conflict resolution and nonviolent training, so that every time there was an opportunity to confront and to challenge and to dismantle a different form of violence, there we were, just trained kind of folks, not sort of off the cuff saying, well, what should we do about this, but already ready as a community of people to respond.
I just got back from a workshop with all the chaplains in the Canadian military, the Protestant side. And I have to say, I found something very encouraging in this experience, because the Canadian military is not like the U.S. military. I mean, they don't have any pretensions of trying to save the world, all that sort of stuff. They see themselves as peacekeepers, and they've been involved in UN peacekeeping actions since the 50s, really. And so they've learned some of the lessons about how to go into a country and stand between the groups and so forth. You got to learn how to handle that sort of stuff. You don't shoot people. So the Canadians are now training some of the American forces on how to do this. Now, I find this very encouraging, because it's the idea of the extension of force, the police force, which I think is a legitimate reality in society. You do need somebody to be able to protect the innocent. We're at one of the most exciting turning points in human history where the human race really is learning to live nonviolently in order to live at all.
When we got together to go on a picket line, we were not allowed to do that without singing together and without reaffirming the love of God and our unity in the world house, as Dr. King talked about it. So it could be that without even knowing it, we already have intact the institution that can provide the new spirit that's necessary for nonviolent resolutions of the conflicts of our time. That qualitative prayer, praise, and celebration may be one of the hidden instruments that God will use to teach us a new pattern for the pursuit of peace without warfare and aggression.
My wife and I were doing a workshop in Sing Sing prison in New York State, very famous prison, and almost all the people in the workshop were murderers, actually. And here we are, way off in this little room by ourselves with this group of murderers teaching nonviolence. And they just kind of scoffed at the idea, nonviolence would never work in this place, man. You got to defend yourself. And all these guys had huge muscles, they worked out on the weights all the time to protect themselves. And one guy had been there about 18 years, and a very intelligent guy. And I said, no, wait a minute. Have you ever been involved in fights and so forth, or violence in the prison? He thought a minute. He said, no, actually I haven't. I said, well, how'd you avoid it? And then he started telling one story after another of how he'd avoided the violence. Every one of them was a story about nonviolent direct action in the situation. So I think a lot of the time people are engaged in nonviolence without even knowing that they're doing it. What are some of the kinds of nonviolent direct action you two have been involved in or know of?
I've sat in, I've prayed in, I've walked in, and occasionally in a situation of hostility, I've participated in a love-in. Let us all stand and declare our love, even though there is hostility in this place. Let the love of God be more powerful. I was arrested in the middle of Fifth Avenue protesting against the policy of our government in Haiti, or at least on Guantanamo Bay, with Jesse Jackson and Susan Sarandon lying down in the middle of the street. Or with my congregation near 125th Street, there's a subway, very high subway. And as we looked at it, it was not well lit. People actually could get mugged on the platforms. We went down first to see the transportation authorities, and then we went down and held services at that station. And then we announced that we were coming back. We demonstrated and sang. I even had a bullhorn and preached at the foot of that subway. And immediately after we had made our protest and our demands known, we discovered that all of a sudden, in a very rapid time, we were able to get the escalators working again. We were able to get ourselves new managers and new posters, new paint, da-da-da-da. Another is the protest against supermarkets that were selling inferior food in the poor community. We first of all did research. We studied up on it and got examples and even did collections of meats, and then appealed to the company and insisted that we were going to encourage the boycotting of these areas if they continued.
What you all were doing was engaging in democracy. And I like to say democracy is nonviolence institutionalized.
I see.
And that kind of activity is not something you do until you get democracy. That is democracy.
That is democracy.
And it'll have to continue all the time because eternal vigilance is the price of freedom. And these powers don't just give up. They move their bad produce to East Harlem since you've gotten it out of West Harlem. So I mean, you have to keep on struggling.
Sure.
How I respond to the guy who cuts me off when I'm driving down the interstate and what that does for the world around me, and inviting other people to respond in new ways. How I behave in a line when folks are really tired and frustrated and angry and nothing's going right and everybody's waiting around for something else to happen. So the sort of persistent day after day little stuff, one step at a time, is new for me in thinking about a nonviolent pattern of life.
I find global nonviolence much easier to conduct than day-to-day nonviolence. I've been involved in, demonstrations against apartheid and so forth, but getting along with a clerk in a store who won't let me return the shirt I bought, that is where my nonviolence breaks down most easily.
All parents have to have nonviolent training, because when our authority is challenged, sometimes it's almost like the wrath of God that wants to give it to them. learning how to restrain that, or in church work. Lord knows. When people, I mean, this is the work of the Lord that they're messing with now. I mean, I have a right. I mean, I want to quote Jesus as if he